皆様こんにちは。本日のフォーラムにお越しいただきまして心より感謝申し上げます。
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining the forum. It is time for us to begin. Let me introduce myself. I am with the Yomiuri Shimbun from the Research Division. My name is Satazawa. I will be serving as the Master of Ceremony today. We have Yomiuri International Economic Society. We have the annual theme of the rising challenges, and this will be the very last forum in this series. The topic is Taiwan and Ukraine, challenging authoritarianism, with the kind cooperation of the delegation from Stanford University, distinguished professors. We are able to have this the forum. We have Ms. Oriana Mastro on your left from the Spogli Institute, and from the API, the president, Professor Jimbo from Keio University. And also joining us on the screen, also from Stanford University, we have Professor Michael McFaul, who is the director of Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. Can you hear me, Professor McFaul?
Your participation.
For part two, let me also introduce the panelists. From the FSI, Stanford University, we have Professor Francis Fukuyama and also Professor Larry Diamond, and also Professor Tsutsui from Stanford University will be serving as a moderator. We will have 1 hour of discussion and question and answers 15 minutes. And on the left-hand side, you can see the indication for the receiver channels. Channel 1 is for Japanese and Channel 2 is English. Yomiuri Shimbun Asia Pacific Initiative and Stanford University Japan Program, the three organizers have been presenting this forum. We will be later asking questions from the audience as well. So we would like to start part one, and I would like to hand over to Professor Jimbo, the moderator. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. The I-House and the API, on behalf of these two sponsors, I would like to thank all of you for joining us for the forum. Asia-Pacific Initiative and I-House have merged together in April last year. So as a think tank, we would like to further strengthen our program and projects going forward. And it so happened that we were indeed very privileged to have eminent professors from Stanford University, 4 speakers, and we very much wanted to have the forum to have a good discussion with the many participants. As was introduced earlier, part 1, we will be taking up Ukraine and Taiwan, those shocking events. It's been about a year since Russia has invaded Ukraine. And with what is happening in Ukraine and what may be the implications to this region, including Taiwan, we would like to have in-depth discussion. So it's been almost 1 year since the incursion by Russia, which has shaken the very foundation of the international order. On the other hand, Europe and the United States have been able to deepen their strategic partnership, and including Japan, many countries have joined in imposing sanctions over Russia. We have seen the dire developments in the past 12 months. The Ukrainian people are commendable in fighting against Russia to defend their dignity and sovereignty. There are many lessons that we will be able to learn from their experience. On the other hand, the international community, as we watch Russia invading Ukraine, how can we impose higher cost on Russia so that Russia will be able to recognize and conclude that their invasion has been a strategic error and mistake. But we have not yet arrived at that end stage. We are still watching how the situation may unfold going forward. We would like to have a good debate on this. Another topic is, of course, Taiwan. At the last series of conference on Yomiuri Forum has also discussed Taiwan. There is rising tension because of the Chinese behavior. There has been the 20th Party Convention of the Chinese Communist Party, which has led to new leadership being announced. And in Taiwan, the new president of the Democratic Party has been chosen, and next year there will be presidential election to be held. So, based upon the lessons learned from Ukraine, how should we address this Taiwan the question is what we would like to discuss today. So, on a virtual basis, it is most unfortunate that Professor McFaul is not be able to be amongst us. But next time, I very much hope that Professor McFaul will be able to visit Japan soon. Now, I would like to ask Professor McFaul, first of all, up until 2011, from 2014, under the Obama administration, he has been ambassador to Russia. He is an expert on Russia. And looking at the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion, it's been almost a year. So, from Ambassador McFaul, from your perspective, what may be the strategic lessons that we have learned from the Russian-Ukrainian situation? And what may be the structure of deterrence and defense of Europe from the U.S. perspective? What has been the impact and changes, please?
Well, first of all, thank you, Professor Jimbo, for having me and everybody. And it's good to see Oriana on the screen and the back of the heads of my colleagues as well. I apologize. I was planning to be with you, and I avoided COVID in 2020. I avoided COVID in 2021 and 2022, but I did not avoid COVID in 2023. So that's why I'm not with you, but I look forward to being with you in the spring or summertime in the future. This is a very crucial time in the world when we're thinking about issues of deterrence. Having just witnessed a historic meeting here in Washington between our leaders, between our Japanese leadership and American leadership, I look forward to the discussion that you'll have about the implications of deterrence in our bilateral relationship with respect to Taiwan. But you asked me a different question. You asked me to reflect on deterrence and the state of the war in Europe. And I think the first observation, it's an obvious one, but I think we need to remember it before we get to all the great things that the United States and NATO and, of course, Ukrainian warriors have done on the battlefield in Ukraine, is to first start by acknowledging that deterrence failed. We did not deter Russia from invading Ukraine for a second time in 2022. We failed at deterrence back in 2014 when they first invaded Ukraine. And I think we could go back all the way to Georgia in 2008 and also say that deterrence failed then. So I think when we're looking for lessons for what to learn from Ukraine with respect to security issues and deterrence in Asia, I think we have to start with why did deterrence fail in 2022? And I would say two or three things to that before talking about where we are at the war right now. First, Mr. Putin went on in his view, for his perception, I want to emphasize, not my perception, but from his perception, Mr. Putin used military force several times before 2022, and he got away with it. So you could go all the way back to the war in Chechnya, when he used force in 1999-2000, but especially Georgia then, 2008, again, Ukraine, 2014. I would add to that list Syria in 2015, when he deployed his air force to help keep in power Mr. Assad. And in all of those instances, he took big risks in using military force, and in the three latter cases abroad in foreign countries, and he was struck by the successes in his view of using military force and the lack of reaction from the West. After 2014, let's not go back to those earlier cases, but after 2014, when he invaded Ukraine, there were sanctions, but relatively modest sanctions. There was no military assistance. And so he learned the lesson from that, that maybe if he did use military force again in 2022, there would be not a very big military response and not a big economic response. And so I think if we think about how to make deterrence more effective with respect to Taiwan, I think it's important to remember that we did not make those credible commitments to deterrence before 2022. And when we get to Oriana and talk about Taiwan, I think we should think about concrete ways that you can enhance deterrence before, rather than waiting for military action to begin. So that's the first thing I would say about the run-up to the war. Number two, I would remind everybody that doesn't think about Putin as long as I have. I met Mr. Putin back in 1991, so we go way back. I've written a lot about him, and for 5 years when I served in the Obama administration, I met him many times. I think it's important to remember about Mr. Putin that he is very motivated by ideology, by a set of ideas about the world that trumps other kind of, security considerations or economic considerations. And I think one of the mistakes we made in the run-up to the war was thinking, well, this is irrational. He would never do something so dangerous or so audacious as to invade, let alone try to annex territory, because we were imposing our cost-benefit analysis on the way that he thinks. And Putin does not think like us. He is motivated by different things. And I'm happy to go in more of that later in questions. The one thing I want everybody to remember, that this was not a defensive war to stop NATO expansion. This was a war to try to correct wrongs that go back in Putin's mind hundreds of years, to try to reunite, in Putin's view, nations that were divided, the Ukrainians and Russians. He doesn't believe they're different peoples. That is the crux of what motivated him to invade, and it was not these short-term calculations about security or economic interests. But then third, and I'll end with this, but happy obviously to answer more questions, I think the other lesson is that he gravely miscalculated in many different fronts. Number one, he overcalculated in terms of the power of his own military capabilities. Remember, before February 24th, 2022, most military analysts in the world, well, I shouldn't say the world, because I'm in an international forum. Most military analysts that I know here in the United States of America, including academics, including those that work in the CIA, including our top military experts on Russia in the US government, assumed that the Russian military was one of the top 3 most capable militaries in the world. United States, China, Russia, that was always the ranking. And if you added up the numbers of how many soldiers they had, how many tanks they had, how much money they spent on military as a percentage of their GDP, Russia looked on paper of having a lot of military capability. We now know that we overestimated that Mr. Putin, in part because of the capabilities he had, in part because of bad strategy, and in part because of underestimating his enemy, the Ukrainian armed forces, that we overestimated the Russian military, excuse me. Number two, I just alluded to it. We underestimated the Ukrainian military. We don't have a lot of experts on Ukrainian military, by the way, in the United States. It was striking to me in the run-up to the war, in all the conversations I was in, including with senior government officials, including from time to time the President of the United States, how shallow our knowledge was about Ukrainian military capabilities. We had a ton of experts on Russia. We didn't have as many on Ukraine. And I think, therefore, we underestimated their capabilities in two respects. One, we forgot that the Ukrainians had been fighting since 2014. I think that's another big distinction when we get to the comparison with Taiwan, but they've been fighting a war. They did not begin fighting the Russians in 2022. They've been fighting since 2024, from 2014, training, including with the California National Guard, to get better, and had greater capabilities than I think we assumed. And then third, Mr. Putin underestimated the response of the United States and NATO on the military side, and I would say the global community of democratic states, including Japan, on the economic side. They did not expect that we would be giving billions of dollars in military assistance to the Ukrainians as fast as we did. They did not expect that many countries would be a part of this coalition, not just the United States. And on the economic side, they did not expect the comprehensive sanctions regime in place today, the most comprehensive sanctions regime implemented against another country in the history of sanctions, I believe, and most certainly in recent history in the last 30 years. And so that miscalculation, I think, has led to major Russian military defeats on the battlefield. They lost the Battle of Kiev. They lost the battle around Kharkiv, the second largest city of Ukraine. The Ukrainian warriors then liberated Kherson and have now rolled back 50% of the territories that the Russians have taken. And so that, I think, was surprising for Mr. Putin. But I'll end on this first question with a question mark about the future. I think 2022 will be remembered as a year of victory for the Ukrainian armed forces and a year of defeat for the Russian armed forces. That doesn't mean that 2023 or 2024 will also be that way. I think it's very uncertain what happens in the future with respect to the way this war plays out. Maybe we'll get to that with the next question. But victory in 2022 does not ensure victory in 2023.
Ambassador McFaul, thank you very much. Thank you so much for a thought-provoking discussion now. For many years, President Putin has been analyzed by you, Ambassador McFaul, and that is why you can say that Russia continues to underestimate, and we tend to overestimate Russian capabilities. You have unpacked that analysis for us. Thank you so much. Now, continuing on, I have another question for Ambassador McFaul, which is what you had said at the end. What about the future? What is going to be the development in the future? In 2022, Ukrainians have resisted, and in a sense, they have scored a tactical victory. But in 2023, is this going to be, or this is not likely to promise, this isn't a promise for victory in 2023. Then, if that is so, this Ukraine war, how is it going to come to an end? How could we see a scenario of this war coming to an end? How can you paint that scenario in your view? And President Putin and Kremlin, how they would withdraw from this war? How can they make a conclusion of withdrawing from this war? What is your assessment, Ambassador McFaul?
Those are impossible questions to answer. They're too hard. Ask some easier ones, please. In all seriousness, I've been reading for an article I'm writing right now, all the assessments of the war back in January and February. And having read how badly we got those wrong, I am not brave enough to try to predict the future today because it is shocking how bad our assessments were, the assessments we made a year ago compared to today. But let me say a few things with that caveat as a preambular statement. Right now, the Ukrainians believe that momentum is on their side. I speak to Ukrainian government officials rather frequently. I just did yesterday to senior Ukrainian officials, and their assessment is that this is the equivalent of 1943 in World War II. That is after the Battle of Stalingrad that the Soviets won, with Ukrainian soldiers too there, by the way. Momentum had shifted, and it was just a matter of time until they knew that the Soviet Union was going to defeat Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. But remember, between 1943 and 45, there were many battles and lots of people died and lots of destruction. But that is their mindset. They believe that the momentum is now on their side, but they also understand that it's going to be a long fight before they liberate all of their territories. And without question, they are still focused on that goal. Whether that's right or wrong, analysts, we can debate, but I think it's important for people to understand that they are not trying to fight to get back to the February 24th borders. They are firmly focused on trying to liberate all of Donbass and the Crimea, To do so, however, they believe that they need new offensive military capabilities to achieve that objective. And therefore, whether they succeed or not will depend on NATO and will depend on the United States. There are three weapon systems in particular that they're focused on: tanks, fighter aircraft, jet fighters, and long-range missile systems. ATACMS are what they're called. And they believe that if they are provided those kinds of weapons in the numbers that they need, they can achieve victory in 2023. I'm not a military expert, but I want you to understand their mindset. Conversely, if you look at what Mr. Putin is saying, I think he believes time is on his side. He is not in as a big a rush in 2023 as what I hear from the Ukrainian side. He believes that if he can fight to a stalemate in 2023 and just be basically at the same place as they are today, the West and the international community of democratic states will begin to lose interest in the war. They are banking on the fact that there are already signs in my country, for instance, within the Republican Party, that there are critics of how much assistance we are providing to the Ukrainians. The last major package, it was $45 billion, was passed back in December, just a month ago, but that's when the Democrats still controlled the House of Representatives. The Russian thinking is that if they can hold on and keep fighting to a stalemate, and they're preparing for their surges and they're preparing to draft more soldiers, but I think they think the longer the war goes, the more likelihood that the West will give up on Ukraine, and that's when they will be able to do what is now, I believe, Putin's minimalist objective, which is to seize de facto the 4 territories that he annexed on paper back in September. Those are the 4 eastern regions of Ukraine that he declared in a ceremony in September as being now part of Russia. And so I don't have the courage to predict which 2 of those scenarios are true, but I hear a sense of urgency on the Ukrainian side. I hear a sense of time is on their side from the Russian side.
Thank you very much. Time is going to favor whom? That's the question, and how the future would develop. I think this could be a war of our perceptions. This is a very important point in formulating our view on the war. Now, in this hall with us, we have Dr. Oriana Mastro. So let us start the discussion with Dr. Mastro. As you know, Dr. Mastro is an expert on military strategy, both on the US as well as in China. She has written in various journals, including Foreign Affairs. She has been voicing her opinions in various outlets. So I'd like to ask Dr. Oriana Mastro. Xi Jinping has entered into his third term, and the positioning of Taiwan, how is it likely to change? How do you view the possibility of changing the positioning of the Taiwan issue in the Xi Jinping administration? Politburo personnel appointments have been made newly. You have a new lineup, and Central Military Commission also has a new leadership team, and Taiwan continues to be their core strategic target. Currently, Dr. Oriana Mastro, how do you assess the situation today?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me here. I was doing a review of my photos in my photo library to remind myself of the last time I was in Japan, and it was about 10 years ago. I tried to think of all the things that had changed in the past 10 years, and until COVID and until the decrease in relations between China and the United States, I spent most of my free time in China. And now I'm much more interested in learning more about allies and partners. And so I really appreciate the invitation to be here to speak today. There's a few points that I want to make about Xi Jinping and China's Taiwan policy. And then I will pick up on something that Mike said about how to enhance deterrence. And I'll give you my 3 points that I think we need to keep in mind when enhancing deterrence against China and Taiwan contingency. There was nothing surprising to me about the Party Congress. There's nothing surprising to me about Xi Jinping most of the time. And the things that Xi Jinping says, how he acts, I think from very early on, in 2013, he was very clear that enhancing China's role on the international stage was going to be a key part of the legitimacy of the Communist Party moving forward. And their understanding of enhancing that legitimacy is also about standing up to the bullying of that foreigners put onto China and achieving their territorial integrity as they define it. I often say people ask me because I talk about conflict, if I have any issues in China. I have frequent interactions now on Zoom, but hopefully soon in person with the party, with the military. There is nothing that I say about the fact that they want to take Taiwan and will take it by force that is controversial in Beijing. It's only controversial, not so much now, but maybe a few years ago when I started talking about the prospect for a war over Taiwan. It's really only controversial to the rest of the world that has seemed to have forgotten how politics works. And me and Mike will disagree, and we'll have a discussion maybe about the lessons China has learned or should learn from Ukraine. But one lesson I hope everyone has learned is that governments and leaders in particular are still willing to fight wars and use force to gain territory that they feel is integral to their understanding of their power. So if anyone had any doubts about that before, I hope those doubts have been resolved. At the Party Congress, Xi Jinping, as was mentioned, elevated certain military leaders to the Central Military Commission, which is the central decision-making body for military affairs. What was interesting but not surprising is that he elevated people with extensive expertise in the joint operational domain and with Taiwan contingencies. From the regions of China that focus on those contingencies, one of the members that was elevated to vice chairman has experience in the Joint Operations Center. It is not surprising. In Chinese media, they very openly call the Central Military Commission the Taiwan clique. It is a group of people who are continuing the focus that has been the focus for 25 years on building a military that can take Taiwan by force. Now, I don't think Xi Jinping needs Taiwan to stay in power. This isn't an argument about weakness. It's not an argument that, He feels pressure domestically, pressure from other elites. He has to do it in this term or he's going to be thrown out. There are many other factors that will determine whether Xi Jinping gets another term. Of course, if he successfully, in the Chinese terminology, reunifies, he's guaranteed to continue power. But I think, and this is an important distinction, the motivation is to do it, if you can do it, to do it as soon as possible. Because you never know, as Professor McFaul said, you never know what the future holds. And we can sit potentially in Stanford or in Tokyo and try to weigh the balance of power and say, well, China can wait, they'll still be, will they be powerful economically? What's the military balance of power in the 2030s? But this is the most important issue for the Communist Party. They are long-term in their thinking. The issue is that we are at the end of the long term. It's been over 70 years, and they've been planning for this moment. So the premise is that Xi Jinping is easily deterrable. He doesn't have to do it. There's no closing window of opportunity, but China wants Taiwan. So what does that mean for our approach to deter him? There's three main things I keep in mind when I assess and provide guidance on U.S. defense policy that I want to use to provide guidance today on Japanese defense policy. So I will say, I know there's that discomfort between a foreigner who knows nothing about Japan coming here to lecture you about your defense policy. So I just want to assure you that I lecture everybody about everything. You can ask my senior colleagues at Stanford. I have no shame in telling everyone that they need to be doing things differently. And these points are one that I have recently made at the highest levels of the U.S. defense establishment. So you are not alone in the three things I'm about to say. I know that, and I am too, very positive about the changes Japan has made, about increase in defense spending, the enhanced coordination between our militaries. The United States has also made significant changes in how we do business in Asia. But I'm not sure any of it matters unless we meet three conditions. The first one is whatever we do in the defense realm has to have an operational impact. So I say this to the U.S. military all the time. They say, Oriana, we're deterring China. We sailed these aircraft carriers through, near the Taiwan Strait, enhances deterrence. Interesting. If a war breaks out, what are those carriers going to do? They're going to leave. So if those carriers have no impact on preventing China from taking Taiwan in a wartime scenario, they do not deter China. And along those lines, from the Japanese point of view, enhancing your defense of the Senkakus does nothing to deter China from taking Taiwan. Unless Japanese operations are going to be involved directly in stopping a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, it's not going to have the impact that you think it will. So even in the United States, we say, oh, but we're doing so much more. If in the end China still calculates that they can take Taiwan quickly and successfully before the United States, Japan, any countries can intervene significantly, we're in the same position today than we were before all these changes. The second point, which seems obvious, is China has to know about any changes that are made. Often, we get this picture that no one wants to upset China. So I'll get reassured, both at the Pentagon and here in Tokyo. Don't worry, we're doing all the right things. We're just keeping it super secret. If the Chinese don't know about any of it, it does not enhance deterrence. They are still not taking it into account. And what we do in peacetime says a lot about what you'll do in wartime. So I often have gotten reassured, don't worry, when the war actually starts, Japan is definitely in. But it's too late. At that point, we're fighting the largest war maybe the world has ever seen. So if in peacetime, the Japanese military, is not engaging in Taiwan Straits transits with the United States, it's reassuring that in wartime we might be fighting together, but if there's no indication in peacetime that that's the case, it does not enhance deterrence. And the last point I want to make, and this again seems obvious, anything we want to do to deter has to happen before the war starts. Again, it seems like an obvious point, but the view that, for example, the Japanese public will support, don't worry, I'm told, don't worry. Once the war starts, the Japanese public will be supportive. Again, too late. There has to be signs. We have to let the Chinese know now that there is that support. There was a series of writings in Chinese journals after the invasion of Ukraine in which they talked about the failure of deterrence and how Russia did not expect the level of sanctions that occurred. And there were a lot of kind of indirect pleas in these Chinese writings that said, if the picture is different than what we currently assess the United States, you should probably let us know sometime soon. Because their assessment is that the economic, political, and military costs are going to be acceptable. And while there's progress towards how we talk about Taiwan, how we're thinking about this issue, fundamentally and operationally, nothing has changed to a degree that makes me think that we've resolved this issue.
Thank
you very much. It was quite stimulating discussion. Now, for Dr. Mastro, in relation to what you have just said, I have a follow-up question. In the first point, you mentioned about the U.S. The aircraft carrier strike group was mentioned, but what may happen in the contingency may be quite different from what will happen as expected during the peace time. The three services, or the first services of the U.S. military for the A2AD, within the A2AD, they are trying to think about the scenario and strategy to fight the war inside the A2AD zone. So within the A2AD zone, they are thinking hard about how can they continue to fight and how can Japan be able to enhance the level of joint operation with the U.S. forces. What is your assessment, Dr. Mastro? U.S. looking at the Chinese modernization of their military. Do you think that U.S. is doing properly in terms of the necessary investment? Do you think that they are aptly formulating the way to fight as a scenario for the future? Or do you think that the U.S. is far behind when it comes to these things?
I give a talk often at the Pentagon in which I try to explain why the United States is doing so little and so late. To me, it's the biggest mystery of all of this. I spend so much time talking about the threat, talking about the sense of urgency, and then you actually look at what's being done, and we are far from doing enough. I'm obviously here speaking in my civilian capacity, and my views do not represent those of the U.S. government, the United States Air Force, or the United States Department of Defense. But in my military job, I spent 13 years trying to deal with this issue of fighting within the A2AD envelope, and we have resolved nothing in 13 years. We cannot defend our bases. I spent years at the Pentagon working on base resiliency efforts. How can we make it so even if China attacks Kadena, we can defend Kadena? We can't. Same with Guam. They're easily saturated by Chinese missiles. I am often asked, how do we enhance deterrence in space? Keep China from attacking our space assets. Keep China from attacking Kadena. Keep them from attacking our ships. The only thing I can come up with is what I call kind of operational resilience. It's extremely attractive for China to attack us in these ways because of how great the impact is on our ability to operate. Right? So right now, the only airfield, the only base we have in the combat range of Taiwan is Kadena. We have one. You shoot a bunch of missiles at Kadena, the United States Air Force can no longer operate, establish air superiority. The Navy surface fleet, therefore, is not coming, so China wins the war. You blind our satellites, we can't talk, China wins the war. So the only things I can think of is trying to create resilience, and that can be more redundancy. But more and more, I think that's about including allies and partners, because China is extremely concerned about widening this war. They only win Taiwan if the war is short, it's geographically limited to Taiwan, and only involves the United States, potentially in Taiwan. So I am convinced that if Japan were to commit to fight with the United States in this contingency, that would be enough to deter China, because the aggregation of our forces outmatch China's, but more importantly, the geography. Someone over dinner yesterday said to me, they were worried. They said, well, Oriana, it takes our submarines 2 to 3 days to get there. It takes our submarines 3 to 4 weeks to get there. And so even if most of the fighting is going to happen with the United States and China, the bottom line is the most useful thing is that Japan has to hold the Chinese off in the immediate beginning of the war to give the United States time to get there. So I have this meeting with some former secretaries of defense the day we land, and so I have this document of what do we need to do, because I often get asked, how do we convince China they can't do this? What should our communication strategy be? And I always say, well, first, it actually has to be true. We'll probably be better off convincing them of something that's true. So the United States needs more platforms. Then we need munitions for those platforms. We do not have even close to enough munitions to even put a dent in the invading force that's coming across the strait. We have to be able to be flexible about when the war starts. So this means that, I think Xi Jinping is going to start moving the invading force before he launches a missile campaign against Taiwan. Politically, we're all limited in what we can do until the war actually starts, and so we have to be agile in that. And then we need more places to operate from, access, basing, and overflight, and we need our allies and partners to be behind us. Once we get those 4 things in line, then the 5th one is to make sure China knows that U.S. and allied capability has changed. But the Chinese aren't stupid, and they're not easily tricked, so I don't think we can convince them that there's been a significant change in our capabilities to operate in this A2AD envelope unless we actually make changes to make that true.
ありがとうございます。ここからはですね、ぜ
Thank
ひ
you
こ
very
の
much. So from here
ウクライ
on,
ナと台湾の
Ukraine and
双方の関係
Taiwan,
について
we
少
want
し
to be talking about
聞
the
いてみたいと
relationship
思いま
between
す。
the
特に
two.
ヨ
Especially
ーロッパ、
in
ロ
Europe,
シアを専門にしているマクフォール大使がこのアジアの
Ambassador
戦略関係を
McFaul, you're an expert on Russia. How do you view the strategic environment in Asia? And Oriana, you're an expert in Asia. What are the lessons that can be learned from Ukraine? Those are the questions that I want to put to you. Ambassador McFaul, in your initial remarks, you've said that the first thing that we need to recognize is that we failed in deterring Russia, and we failed many times before. That is what you said earlier. So from here on, when we look at China, as Dr. Oriana Mastro said, there was a very severe assessment of the situation regarding China. So in order to avoid failing to deter China, what do we have to do now? Ambassador McFaul, as you look at the strategic environment in Asia through the lens of Ukraine, what are your assessments? What are the views that you have? Please.
Sorry, I was coughing. I didn't want you to hear me coughing. So sorry for being on mute. So great questions. I want to emphasize I'm not an expert on China or Taiwan or the US military, but I listened to Oriana a lot, and I agree with everything she said about deterrence. I think that is the lesson of failure of deterrence in Europe that should be done now with respect to how to avoid war concerning Taiwan. Think about what if instead of announcing a few weeks ago that the United States is going to send a Patriot battery, that 20 years ago, the United States sent Patriots or THAAD or Aegis SM-3 missiles that are on Aegis ships, or sometimes they're now in Romania and Poland. What if we had put in a multi-layered missile defense system many, many years ago, rather than trying to start right now? Think about how that may have changed Putin's thinking about invading. One of the things I think we all need to study, again, I'm not an expert, but I listening to Ukrainians speak about this, is what we've learned about missile defenses, how useful cruise missiles are or not, how useful drones are or not, and what can be defended with different kinds of platforms. I think there's a lot that can be learned. And I think there's some misconceptions, particularly about cruise missiles, by the way, that if we learned, we might be able to enhance, especially those defensive capabilities now. Second, I would say the same thing about the offensive capabilities. The Ukrainians received a very important weapon. It's called a HIMARS. It's a medium-range missile system, multiple rocket launch system. It has changed a lot on the battlefield, but they didn't receive that before the war. They received it midstream during the war. And so the more of those kinds of systems that are in place ahead of time, you're obviously going to enhance deterrence. And third, I would add to that on the economic side. I was part of the negotiations, discussions as an outsider with colleagues of mine in the Biden administration about whether they should be specific about what economic sanctions they would impose if Russia invaded. And at the time, I was a proponent for announcing those ahead of time, along the lines of what Oriana said. It does no good after the fact. You don't deter anything if you do it after the fact. My argument was announce it ahead of time so that Putin will know exactly what we plan to do. One of the reasons I was a proponent of that, by the way, is I wanted to tie our own hands because I was worried that we might think, well, let's not do the most extreme measures. And so if you announce it ahead of time, you make your commitment to that more credible than not. But the reason that was given by White House officials to me why they did not want to do that is they worried that trying to have a debate about sanctions among the democratic states that were going to impose them ahead of time would show our divisions. And I'm just reporting that. I don't know whether that was right or wrong, but I think if there's a way on the economic side to say ahead of time of what we plan to do, that would be a lesson learned of failure from deterrence that we learned in Ukraine that we might achieve with respect to Taiwan and China. And then the last lesson, I alluded to it, but let me be more explicit about it. And I want to be careful here because I'm not an expert, but I did travel with Oriana and Larry, who's with you, to Taiwan over the summer. And what was striking to me, listening to Taiwan officials, senior officials, talk about their preparations for war compared to what the Ukrainians were doing for 8 years, it just struck me that the Ukrainians were way more prepared for this war than Taiwan is today. You know, simple things like military spending, training, 4 months versus a year versus 2 years. And as I already said, combat experience. So the more of that can be done ahead of time, I think is another important lesson in terms of deterrence. And then finally, I would just say, just to echo something Oriana said, that sometimes leaders can be motivated by ideas, ideologies, grievances from the past that will cause them to not worry about the consequences, the costly consequences of war. either with respect to soldiers, costs of war, or sanctions. But you want to present an argument about those costs, not just to try to sway Xi Jinping, but to think about all of Chinese society, all of Chinese economic actors, so that they know that this will be catastrophically costly for everyone. This will not be a limited war. It won't be something that'll just happen overnight. And I think engaging in that debate ahead of time can also enhance deterrence.
Thank you very much. That was quite interesting point that you have made just now. Now I would like to ask Oriana the same question. Naturally, the lessons to be learned from Ukrainian situation for us, be it Japan or US, must learn the lessons, but China, Xi Jinping and his team should also learn the lesson. So the question is on both. You could answer the just one side, or you could also talk about China as well as US and Japan as well, please.
Thank you for that. I think there are many things that all sides should be learning, and I'm happy that you've asked also what lessons we should learn, because often I get the question, what lessons should China learn? And more specifically, what lessons should China learn from Russia's failures? And I often point out that we never ask what lessons the US military should learn from Russia's failures. In that we like to think of Ukraine as Taiwan and Russia as China, but the Chinese think about Russia as the United States, right? That has been great power in decline, that lashes out, that has large, bulky equipment, that doesn't have the resolve to fight the way the Ukrainians do. I mean, that's how China sees itself, right? The United States has aircraft carriers, they have DF-21Ds. Maybe the United States will fight, but they're not willing to pay the same costs the Chinese are. And so I think China is paying attention, but it isn't the case that the lessons they've learned are that their military can't do this, and they haven't learned the lesson that the cost would be too high for two reasons. The first is they also have seen the Russian military struggle. And there are sort of three main reasons to simplify why the Russian military has had difficulty. Munitions, command and control, and logistics. Now the Chinese, and in particular under Xi Jinping in 2013, Xi Jinping took a look at his military, and he did what Putin probably should have done before the invasion of Ukraine. He said, well, you guys have a lot of fancy stuff. I don't know if any of you know how to really use any of it well. He thought his forces were poorly trained. They were unable to engage in joint operations. There used to be these specials on Chinese TV to show the mobility of the force. That was just Chinese troops moving from one city to another city. And I used to say in my courses, if you need to make a big deal out of the fact that your military can move from one part of your country to another part of your country, all that says is how immobile you are. And so the Chinese recognized they had these challenges, and under the guidance of Xi Jinping, they've engaged in massive organizational reforms to improve. So the Joint Logistics Command was just set up, honing their command and control. So people often ask me, why hasn't China taken Taiwan yet? It really is because these organizational changes just were put into place about 2 years ago. And so now China wants to do a series of exercises to make sure that everything's the way it is. So if anything, it's not like Ukraine was shocking to them militarily, but it does highlight how important command and control and logistics are. I think that Taiwan was so important, they wanted to be sure that they had everything set anyway. Maybe now we can say they want to be extra sure that command and control and logistics are solid before we go. On the economic side, I think the Chinese felt like they had to put in some extra work to figure out, to make sure that countries were not going to severely sanction China in the event of an attack on Taiwan. I don't think, limited economic sanctions would be enough to deter Xi Jinping. I think we need a level of economic disengagement that would cause a depression in China, not, a decrease in GDP growth, but sort of negative growth of 15, 20, 25% that first year to have any impact. And my understanding, talking to people in the region, is there's not a lot of appetite with countries to put that level of sanctions on China. China is not Russia, right? Singapore might proudly put sanctions on Russia, but they have less than $2 billion of trade with Russia, right, and 60 with China. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And to Mike's point, we war game stuff all the time, right? Contingency plans. What is our military going to do? What is your military going to do? And it's my understanding that we don't go into that level of work in detail on the economic and diplomatic side, but maybe we should. I'll tell you the lessons that we should learn, and this is where you can tell that I get increasingly frustrated by these questions. There is no sense of real urgency about this. I know we all talk about how there's a new sense of urgency. Deterrence is expensive, and there's trade-offs. But there's one thing that is more expensive than deterrence, and that is major war. So when I hear, even in the United States and in Japan, the economic costs, Japanese and US businesses are not happy with the idea of A, B, and C. I briefed bankers for 3 days in New York recently. How many times they said to me, Oriana, but if there's a war over the Taiwan Strait, Teslas will be delayed. And I said, nobody cares about your Teslas. I'm sitting there looking at thousands, tens of thousands of people being killed and the prospect of nuclear war. I don't care about your Teslas. And yeah, you're just going to have to use your old iPhone for another couple years. You'll survive. Yes, there are economic costs to deterrence. Maybe many of our companies, both in the United States, Japan, want to be able to trade certain things, manufacture certain things in China. Well, I'm sorry, you can't. That time is over. The South Koreans don't want the United States to use our assets in South Korea to deter China. I'm sorry, South Korea. The strategic environment has changed. We should not be concerned about sparking this war. I hear this a lot in the United States too. What if we say something, we do something, and then we cause a war that didn't need to happen? The bottom line is there's no scenario in which China gets full control over Taiwan peacefully. On a good day, 6% of the people of Taiwan are willing to consider being a part of the PRC. This can only happen by force. So the question is, do we want a happy China that is undeterred or an unhappy China that's deterred? Those are our only two options. And so there's a lot of, I'll give you one last example. I recently was advising the US military that they need to have a certain plan, a certain war plan. And again, they said to me, Oriana, you don't understand anything about how wars are fought, It would take us 18 months to put together this plan. I said, okay, if China attacked Taiwan tomorrow, how long would it take you to put together the plan? 6 days? Then do it in 6 days. Let's start thinking about how to actually change the environment with the sense of urgency that we need. Because my biggest fear is that we're going to find ourselves in a major war, and it's not even the cost of the war, which will be massive. But, I go to China all the time. I have close interactions with Chinese colleagues. While I have a difference of opinion with the Chinese government on a number of issues, I understand their position on many of those issues. If I were Chinese, I'd be doing the same things. I don't think of any scenario in which we fight a major war with China and then any of us get to have any interaction with that country ever again. We're going to be in 2 blocks for the rest of my lifetime. And that to me just seems so sad that it's worth maybe, having to pay a bit more taxes. People of Taiwan, I know you don't want to serve in the military, but guess what? Too bad you live in Taiwan. You have to serve to protect the island. So there's sacrifices that are going to have to be made, but the alternative, in my view, is worse. And so I hope that that's where the debate is going, and we get the motivation we need to make the changes that are necessary.
ありがとうございます。
Professor Jimbo, could I make
Thank you
one
very-
comment just to
Sure.
add to that? Just
Sure, please go
one
ahead.
piece on the economic side in terms of a lesson, just echoing some of the things Oriana said.
Sure.
I just want to remind everybody that in the run-up to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the consensus among bankers and oil companies and those that did business with Russia was this will be a small interruption, but basically there's too much interdependence here for us to cut off, particularly on oil and gas in Europe. That was the debate in February. I think it's important and instructive, and I hope Beijing is paying attention, that that turned out to be not true. It turned out that it was possible to reduce drastically oil and gas coming into Europe, and that they took the sacrifices that Oriana's talking about. Europeans have done that. And as a result, Russia is I have the statistics here. I think it's 106. They have significantly less resources today to fight their war than they anticipated. Thousands of companies left Russia willingly, not because governments sanctioned them, but because they said, we cannot do business with this barbaric country. And I think we need to remember that if China, unprovoked, invades Taiwan, at least in my country, it will be impossible for companies to say, well, you know, that's some dispute they had a long time ago. It's not our business. There's no way politically that will fly. And I think that is very important to look at just how much economic dislocation happened with a country that was not integrated into the global economic world in the same way that China has. I think in the same way that Xi Jinping is motivated ideologically and he's willing to take economic risks of that, I think people are underestimating how much political pressure there will be. And I'm not speaking about Japan. I don't know the politics in your country. But when people are dying in Taiwan because of this horrible invasion, it will be impossible for American companies, banks, all of the companies that do business there to say, no, you know, we have to move on. I think it'll be a very big dislocation that will have very deep economic consequences for the Chinese economy.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much
私の方でちょ
indeed.
っと1、2分ぐらいお話しして、その
I
間
would like
に
to speak for a couple of
会場からよ
minutes
ろしければ
myself, and then we would like to collect 2 or so questions from the
で
audience.
事前にいただいた質問も
We
含めて
also
パネリ
have
ストにお返しする
questions
という
that
こ
are
とを
being received
したいと思います。もし
beforehand
ご質問ご希望の方
as
は
well.
その間に
So those of you
ご
who
準備をして
have
いただければ
questions,
と
please
思いま
prepare
す。
yourself.
で
As
企画サイドから日本にとっての意味を数点述べようということで
I was asked by the Secretariat that I should explain about the salient points for Japan. The Russian aggression against Ukraine. The biggest implication for Japan is, as I have already mentioned, how can we be able to build the proper deterrence against such a situation happening in this region? And the Japanese people that have opted to go for reinforcing our defense capabilities, and there is already a wide-ranging consensus on this. The so-called 3 strategic documents, which were published at the end of December, was the consequence of that. But what we have chosen is to catch up with China militarily or try to increase the number of the bombers or fighters. That was not what we have chosen for. What we have understood is that we are inferior as compared to China. We do admit that. We do recognize that. But trying to stop, to have a capability to deny China trying to change the status quo
To that extent, we would like to increase our capability militarily, or our defense capability. And as much as possible, we would like to expand what we can do ourselves. And that would be conducive to the deterrence of the region as well. And the U.S. is not free of charge, so to speak, extending its deterrence to Japan. We also have to pay for ourselves and jointly to move forward with the United States in enhancing our deterrence. So that is what I wanted to explain. And then I would like to ask one or two questions from the audience, and please be brief and concise. There are also several questions already received in advance, and some of them have already been answered during the discussion. What is necessary in order to advance Japan-Taiwan relations? Something like Taiwan Relations Act in the United States. Could similar legislation be possible for Japan? I would like to ask Dr. Mastro, in terms of relationship between Japan and Taiwan, what would you expect for the bilateral relationship? So later, I would like to pose this question to Oriana. But before that, anybody who would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There is one person in the back and the another person.
Professor Eto, yes, go ahead. My name is Eto. I'm head of the Chinese group at Geoeconomics Institute. Thank you very much for a very insightful discussion. I do have a question for Dr. Oriana Mastro. From strategic rationality, you talked about deterrence. So I would like to ask you about your views, because in today's discussion, assuming a worst-case scenario to enhance deterrence, that need was advocated by you today. And as I am an expert on Chinese politics, China, in order not to be defeated, they are expanding their military capabilities, and they're continuing on that path. So build-up of their defense capabilities is being enhanced. So when there is competition over military build-up, are there any chances of us being prevailing? Because authoritarian regimes, they disregard rationality to build their defense capabilities, meaning could be obstacles. So I would like to ask for your views on this point. And Dr. Suzuki, please.
Thank you. Ambassador McFaul and Dr. Mastro, thank you very much for indeed highly interesting comments. My name is Suzuki. I'm the director of Geoeconomics Institute. So a follow-up to what Professor Eto has said. As a deterrence, economic sanctions, to what extent was it effective? Ambassador McFaul, you mentioned already that we need to have proper deterrence, and for economic sanctions menu, we need to, in advance, clearly communicate and announce of this. To what extent economic sanctions would be effective as a deterrence? For economic sanctions, you have to have economic calculation to be fully established in order to be able to pose as a deterrence. But Russia, especially Putin, was not actually influenced by economic rationale. So how can we utilize still economic sanctions as a deterrence? Do you have any advice, please? Thank you.
So changing the sequence, we would like to go to Dr. Oriana Mastro to respond. As was asked in the first question, U.S. and China, they are in competition to raise the escalation ladder. So what are the prospects of U.S. prevailing in this competition? And Japan and Taiwan relationship, what is it that you expect? So those are the questions for you, Oriana. And to Ambassador McFaul, economic sanctions as a tool of deterrence, how effective do you think it is? Those are the final questions. Can you answer in 3 minutes? I would like to ask you to conclude in 3 minutes, starting with Oriana.
Thank you. So the first thing I just want to say is I'm not sure I agree with the premise in the question about expansion, about autocratic regimes, and in this case, China not being rational about their defense spending. One of my primary complaints in the competition is that the Chinese seem to be much more pragmatic and rational in their spending than the United States is. One of the statistics I like to give is that the war in Afghanistan cost the equivalent of 10 Belt and Road initiatives. Many years up until the early 2000s, the United States spent more on its nuclear weapons than the Chinese spent on its whole military. The competition hasn't been because China's outspent us. This whole time, and even today, we have more economic resources, the United States alone, and most definitely the United States and Japan, than China does. They've been very entrepreneurial, however, in the types of military capabilities they build so that they don't fall in the trap of sort of being outspent the way the Soviet Union did. But I take your general point, which is there is no end to this. You know, I only have ideas about how to deter the conflict for now. But absolutely, anything we do, China is then going to have to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to counter it. If Japan and the United States clearly brings our forces together, so our Navy is bigger than China's, they might build more ships. They might seek a two-front alliance with Russia. If we put missiles in second island chain countries, they will increase the ranges of their missiles to take out those missiles before they attack Taiwan. But the point is, in my mind, there's no closing window. They're not going to risk losing Taiwan, and they have confidence in their ability to figure out counters. So it's not the case that we make an advancement, and then they're like, we have to invade Taiwan tomorrow because of this advancement. But they will figure out a way eventually. And all I can say is I hope for some sort of completely unpredictable situation in the world that makes this Taiwan problem go away. I don't know what that would be, but I don't have any ideas. I just have ideas about how to delay it. And then they'll say about Taiwan-Japan relations. In the United States, at least, I often put this in the camp of it has no operational impact, so we should not do it. So I wrote some op-eds for the New York Times when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, when President Biden makes statements about defending Taiwan. If this just upsets China and it does not improve our military prospects at all, I do not support it. But when we were in Taiwan, I had a bit of a change of heart because what we learned from senior leaders in Taiwan is they felt like those political maneuvers increased the morale of the people of Taiwan to fight. And we do need the people of Taiwan to be able to hold off. So there seems to be some trade-offs. So for Japan, if you say to me, listen, if we increase our relationship with Taiwan and make some political changes in our support for Taiwan and institutions, or we call Taiwan by a different name, or we do all these things that obviously the PRC will be upset about, but this is what's necessary to get the Japanese people on board with the defense of Taiwan, then I would say we should do it. But if it doesn't actually change anything in terms of the operational picture, I think it's very provocative for little benefit.
ありがとうございます。それでは最後に
Thank you very
大使
much.
お願いいた
Lastly
しま
but not
す。
least, Ambassador McFaul, please.
Well, I know our time is limited and I'm about to lose my voice, so I'll be brief. Even dictatorships have interest group politics. Even dictatorships have societal preferences that don't always align with the general secretary or Mr. Putin. And I think what is striking, looking at what's happening domestically inside Russia today, is that economic elites, none of them think this war was a good idea. All of them are suffering, except one or two companies, state-owned enterprises close to the president. And that will be exacerbated, I think, in multiple ways greater in China, because China is so much more connected to the outside world. And so we're talking about a global depression, not a recession. From the statistics I've seen, if we're serious about sanctions, it will lead to a global depression that will also destroy the Chinese economy. And I think the clearer we can make that, that this will be the economic implication, the better chance we have of, as Oriana said, kicking the can down the road. Because Xi Jinping may be obsessed with his place in history. But there are, I know, many Chinese elites that radically disagree with his calculations. And so we want to make them understand the giant consequences of those actions. And I'm convinced that we do have the capabilities to put in those kinds of sanctions. We haven't even used the word embargo yet, but there are ways to make this very costly if we have the will to do it. And then second, would we credibly communicate it ahead of time as a way to enhance deterrence?
はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you so very much.
おかげさまで、マクフォール大使、そして
Ambassador McFaul and Dr. Oriana Mastro,
充実した
they have given us a very rich, fruitful
というふうに考えて
discussion.
おります。この議論ですね、
Now, this
今
discussion
年も安全保障戦略論の中心を占める
will continue to be the center of security strategy discussion. So as to what the prospects we can have for the year, I think this served as a very important discussion starting point. Now, part one ends now. Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. McFaul, Professor McFaul, and Dr. Oriana Mastro for their great contribution. Thank you very much.